The exact moment my sister yanked me out of my wheelchair, every conversation inside the ballroom died. Glasses stopped clinking. The photographer lowered his camera. Even the string quartet seemed to miss a beat. I remember staring at Vivian's hand wrapped around my wrist, wondering how someone who had known me my entire life could look at me with so much certainty and so little compassion. "Quit pretending you're hurt," she snapped loudly enough for nearly 200 wedding guests to hear. "You're ruining my pictures." Before I could pull away, she jerked me forward. My legs tried to obey, but they couldn't react fast enough. My balance disappeared almost instantly. I stumbled, reached for the armrest that was no longer beneath me, and fell hard onto the polished floor. The room gasped. Pain wasn't the first thing I felt. Humiliation was. I heard someone scream my name. Someone else rushed toward me. Then there was silence. The kind of silence that only comes after people realize they've witnessed something they can never pretend they didn't see. Lying there, staring at the crystal chandelier above me, I realized this wasn't actually the moment my family broke. It was only the moment everyone else finally noticed the cracks. 3 years earlier, my life looked nothing like that ballroom floor. I worked as a medical records quality auditor for one of the largest healthcare systems in my state. Most people thought my job sounded boring, but I loved it. Every day was about facts instead of assumptions. A missing detail could change a diagnosis. A single incorrect note could affect someone's future. Accuracy mattered. Truth mattered. I liked knowing there was always evidence, somewhere if people cared enough to look for it. Outside work, I hiked on weekends, volunteered at an animal shelter twice a month, and rarely missed family dinners on Sundays. If someone had asked me then who my best friend was, I probably would have answered my older sister. Vivian was 3 years older than me and had always been the kind of person who naturally drew attention. She was beautiful without trying, confident without apologizing, and somehow managed to make every room revolve around her. Growing up, teachers loved her. Relatives bragged about her. Even strangers remembered her name. I never resented that. It was simply how our family worked. Vivian shined. I quietly supported everyone around her. My parents often joked that Vivian inherited my mother's charm while I inherited my father's patience. At the time, it sounded like a compliment. Looking back, I realized patience was often another word for accepting less. Sunday dinners were predictable. Vivian told dramatic stories about work. Everyone laughed. My father asked thoughtful questions. My mother refilled everyone's glasses before they were empty. I usually listened more than I spoke, and I honestly didn't mind. Not every family needs 2 people fighting for attention. At least that's what I believed then. The first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was driving to work when my vision blurred for a few seconds. My hands suddenly felt numb. By lunchtime, I couldn't walk across the office without grabbing furniture for balance. My coworkers insisted on calling an ambulance despite my protests. I kept telling everyone I was probably dehydrated or exhausted. I expected to leave the hospital with vitamins and instructions to sleep more. Instead, I spent nearly 2 weeks undergoing neurological testing. The diagnosis wasn't simple. It wasn't dramatic enough for television, but it changed everything. My neurologist explained that I had developed a rare neurological condition affecting balance, muscle coordination, and fatigue. Some days I could walk almost normally. Other days my legs refused to cooperate without warning. This condition doesn't follow a schedule, my doctor explained while pointing to brain scans spread across his desk. You'll have good days and bad days. What matters is preventing unnecessary injuries. I asked him the question I had been avoiding. Will I need a wheelchair? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward and spoke carefully. You'll need whatever keeps you safe. Using a wheelchair during longer outings or crowded places isn't giving up. It's protecting your independence. That sentence stayed with me far longer than the diagnosis itself. I cried the entire drive home after my discharge. Not because I believed my life was over, because I knew people would see the chair before they ever saw me again. My parents visited almost every day while I recovered. My father carried groceries upstairs without being asked. My mother researched accessible home modifications and insisted on installing handrails before I even agreed. Vivian also visited. She brought flowers, expensive chocolate, and enough cheerful energy to convince every nurse that she was the perfect older sister. "You'll be back to normal before you know it," she smiled. "You're too stubborn to let something like this slow you down." At first, her optimism comforted me. I wanted someone to believe I'd recover completely. I wanted to believe it too. Physical therapy became my new routine. Every tiny improvement felt like winning a marathon, standing for an extra 30 seconds, walking across a room without holding onto furniture, climbing 3 stairs instead of 2. My therapists celebrated every milestone because they understood progress wasn't always permanent. Some days I'd improve. Other days I'd lose abilities I'd gained the week before. That's how neurological conditions often work. Unfortunately, those complicated realities were invisible to people who only saw snapshots of my life. About 6 months after my diagnosis, my family gathered for my mother's birthday. I decided not to bring my wheelchair because I knew there would only be a few steps inside the restaurant. I managed surprisingly well that evening. I stood for photo. I walked carefully from the table to the restroom with my father's arm for support. I was exhausted by the end of dinner, but I felt proud. Then Vivian laughed while scrolling through pictures on her phone. "See," she said casually, "you walked almost the whole night." I smiled. "I had help." "Still," she replied with a shrug, "maybe the wheelchair isn't as necessary as everyone thinks." The table went strangely quiet. My father looked down at his plate. My mother quickly changed the subject by asking whether anyone wanted dessert. Nobody corrected Vivian. Nobody reminded her that I'd spent the previous 3 days barely able to stand. Nobody mentioned the doctor, who had specifically warned against measuring my condition by isolated moments. That silence lasted maybe 10 seconds. It lasted much longer inside my memory. Driving home that night, I kept replaying the conversation. Maybe Vivian didn't mean anything by it. Maybe she simply didn't understand. Maybe next time Mom or Dad would explain things properly. Families misunderstand each other sometimes. That didn't mean they stopped loving one another. I convinced myself those explanations were enough. I had no idea those 10 silent seconds would quietly become the foundation for everything that followed. Over the next several months, one harmless comment slowly turned into a pattern I couldn't ignore. And the worst part wasn't that my sister had stopped believing me. It was that the 2 people who knew the truth better than anyone never said a word. After that birthday dinner, Vivian never accused me of lying outright. Not at first. She was smarter than that. Instead, she planted little seeds of doubt everywhere she went, and somehow those tiny comments grew into opinions before I even realized they had been shared. It started with harmless jokes. At least everyone else seemed to think they were harmless. If I stood to reach something on a shelf, she'd grin and say, "Looks like another miracle recovery." If I accepted my wheelchair at a crowded event, she'd whisper just loudly enough for someone nearby to hear. Funny how she always needs it when people are watching. People laughed awkwardly because they didn't know what else to do. I laughed too, mostly because I didn't want to become the reason another family gathering felt uncomfortable. Looking back, I wish I had stopped pretending those comments didn't hurt. My neurologist had warned me about something called invisible disability bias. He explained that people struggle to understand conditions that change from day to day. Some people, he said during one appointment, would rather believe you're exaggerating than accept that not every illness looks the same every hour. I nodded politely then. I didn't realize he had just described my own sister. My condition never followed predictable rules. Some mornings I could walk through the grocery store using only a cane. The next day I might barely make it from my bedroom to the kitchen without my legs trembling. Crowded places were always the hardest because people bumped into me unexpectedly. Long periods of standing drained my muscles faster than most people could imagine. The wheelchair wasn't a prison, it was freedom. It allowed me to keep living instead of staying home. Vivian refused to see it that way. She treated every good day as evidence that every difficult day was fake. One Saturday afternoon, my mother invited everyone over to help organize old family photo albums. I actually felt surprisingly strong that morning. I left my wheelchair in the car and used my cane instead. We spent hours sorting pictures across the dining room table. I even carried a small storage box upstairs by myself. Vivian watched quietly the entire time. As I reached the top step, she smiled in a way that instantly made me uncomfortable. "You're getting around pretty well today," she said. "I'm glad you're finally admitting you're stronger than you pretend." I froze. That's not what this means. "Then what does it mean?" she asked with an innocent expression that fooled everyone except me. "Yesterday you needed your chair. Today you're carrying boxes upstairs." Before I could answer, my father cleared his throat. For one hopeful second, I thought he was finally going to explain everything. Instead, he said, "Let's stay focused on the albums. Your mother's been waiting weeks to do this." The conversation ended exactly where it always ended. Not because anyone solved it, because everyone else preferred silence. Later that afternoon, while my mother was washing dishes, I found her alone in the kitchen. "Mom," I asked quietly, "why didn't anyone say anything?" She didn't look at me right away. She kept drying the same plate over and over. "You know how Vivian gets, yes?" I replied. "That's exactly why someone should say something." She sighed heavily. "She's under a lot of stress with the wedding planning." I don't want another argument. I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. She wasn't choosing Vivian because she believed her. She was choosing the easier conversation. Somehow that realization hurt even more. A few weeks later, I had another appointment with my neurologist. My latest test results actually showed improvement in one area. My balance exercises were helping. My endurance had increased slightly. I left the office feeling hopeful for the first time in months. While driving home, I called my parents to share the news. My father sounded genuinely happy. "That's wonderful," he said. "Your hard work is paying off." My mother immediately suggested celebrating with dinner the following weekend. I smiled during the entire conversation. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "Mom told me your appointment went well." See, maybe all those doctors were too dramatic after all. I stared at the screen for several seconds before typing a response. I deleted 3 different replies before settling on a simple one. "Progress doesn't mean I'm cured," she answered almost immediately. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." I didn't respond again. Arguing with Vivian had become like trying to explain colors to someone determined to stay blind. Around that same time, Daniel began appearing at more family gatherings. He and Vivian had been dating for nearly 2 years, and everyone loved him. He was thoughtful without being overly talkative. He remembered birthdays. He helped clear dishes after meals without being asked. Most importantly, he actually listened when people spoke. During one barbecue, I noticed him watching as Vivian made another joke about my wheelchair. "Careful." She laughed while I positioned myself on the patio. "She'll probably race you to the dessert table." A few relatives chuckled. Daniel didn't. Instead, he glanced toward me before quietly changing the subject. It wasn't much, but I noticed, a month later. He caught up with me after another family dinner while Vivian searched for her purse inside the house. "Can I ask you something?" he said carefully. "Of course." "Your condition?" He hesitated, obviously trying not to offend me. "Does it fluctuate?" I smiled for what felt like the first genuine smile I'd shared with someone outside my doctors and closest friends. "Every day." He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." I looked at him curiously. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because what Vivian says sometimes doesn't match what I actually see." Before I could answer, Vivian walked outside carrying her purse. "There you are," she called. "Ready?" Daniel smiled politely, but I noticed something had changed in his expression. He wasn't convinced anymore. Not completely, just enough to start asking questions. That tiny shift would matter more than either of us realized. Wedding planning consumed the family over the next several months. Every Sunday dinner became another discussion about flower arrangements, guest lists, seating charts, or venues. Vivian wanted everything flawless. Every napkin had to match. Every centerpiece had to sit exactly 2 inches from the table's edge. Every photograph had to look like it belonged in a bridal magazine. At first I admired her attention to detail. Then I realized perfection wasn't her goal. Control was. She corrected vendors over the smallest details. She argued with caterers about plate placement. She even criticized bridesmaids for wearing the wrong shade of nail polish to a fitting. Everyone excused her behavior with the same sentence: "She's just stressed." I began to wonder how many cruel choices people justified simply because someone happened to be planning a wedding. About 6 weeks before the ceremony, my mother called me unexpectedly. "Vivian wants family portraits after the ceremony," she explained. "She's worried about space on the stage." "Okay," I replied. The photographer suggested arranging everyone in rows. She paused. "Would you maybe consider standing for just a minute if you're able?" My chest tightened. There it was again. Another request that sounded reasonable until you remembered who it was really protecting. "If I'm able," I answered carefully. "I always do." She sounded relieved. "I know. I just want the day to go smoothly." After hanging up, I sat in silence for several minutes. Nobody had asked whether standing would be safe. Nobody asked what my doctor recommended. The only question anyone seemed interested in was whether I could make the pictures easier for Vivian. That evening, my best friend Nora stopped by with takeout. She took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Family," she guessed. I laughed bitterly. "Is it that obvious?" She handed me a container of noodles before sitting across from me. I told her everything, including my mother's phone call. When I finished, Nora stayed quiet for a moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Elara, there's a difference between keeping the peace and sacrificing your dignity. You've been confusing those two things for years." I wanted to argue. Instead, I started crying, because somewhere deep down, I already knew she was right. 2 days later, my formal invitation to Vivian's wedding arrived in the mail. I held it in my hands for almost an hour before opening it. For the first time since she got engaged, I honestly wondered if staying home might hurt less than showing up. But I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I didn't go, my absence would become another story Vivian could rewrite however she wanted. So I made my decision. I would attend my sister's wedding. I just didn't know that walking into that ballroom would be the last time I ever walked into my family believing silence could still protect us. The morning of Vivian's wedding arrived with clear skies, cool air, and the strange kind of quiet that only exists before a day everyone expects to be perfect. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror longer than I normally would, adjusting the sleeves of my navy blue dress while my wheelchair waited beside the bed. It wasn't the dress I worried about. It wasn't even the chair. It was the feeling sitting in my stomach that refused to leave. Every instinct I had told me something wasn't right. I couldn't explain why. Nothing specific had happened. There were no threatening messages or dramatic arguments during the previous week. Still, the closer I came to leaving for the venue, the harder it became to ignore that uncomfortable feeling. Nora noticed it immediately when she arrived to drive me there. "You look like you're heading into a courtroom instead of a wedding," she joked as she helped load my wheelchair into her SUV. I forced a smile. "Maybe I am." She looked at me for a second before closing the trunk. "You still don't have to go." I knew she meant it. More than anyone else, Nora understood that showing up wasn't about celebrating Vivian anymore. It was about proving to myself that I refused to disappear simply because someone else wanted me invisible. "If I stay home," I said quietly, fastening my seat belt, "I'll spend years wondering if avoiding one uncomfortable day would have changed anything." Nora nodded. "Then today isn't about your sister. It's about you refusing to hide." I repeated those words to myself during the entire drive. The venue sat beside a quiet lake about 40 minutes outside the city. It was elegant without being extravagant, exactly the kind of place Vivian had spent over a year searching for. Fresh white flowers lined the entrance. Staff members welcomed guests with champagne. Every detail looked like it belonged in a bridal magazine. As Nora unloaded my wheelchair, I noticed several relatives already gathering near the entrance. Most greeted me warmly. My Aunt Denise hugged me carefully before asking how I had been feeling. My cousin Michael offered to help carry my bag. Those small moments reminded me that not everyone in my family had accepted Vivian's version of who I was. Some people simply didn't know what to believe anymore. My mother hurried toward me almost as soon as she saw me. She looked beautiful in a soft silver dress, but her smile seemed strained. "I'm so glad you came," she said, kissing my cheek. "How are you feeling?" "A little nervous." "Everything will be fine," she answered quickly. The speed of her reply told me she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "Vivian's been emotional today." I almost laughed. Emotional had become my family's favorite excuse. Angry became emotional, cruel became emotional, manipulative became emotional. Somehow everyone else's feelings always required accommodation except mine. Before I could respond, someone called my mother's name from inside the venue. She squeezed my shoulder gently. "We'll talk later, okay?" I watched her walk away, wondering how many conversations in our family had ended with those same 3 words. "We'll talk later." Later almost never came. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Vivian looked radiant walking down the aisle. Daniel smiled at her with genuine affection, and for a brief moment I found myself hoping marriage might somehow soften the parts of her personality that had grown sharper over the years. People change sometimes. Maybe this would be one of those stories where everything somehow worked out despite the warning signs. Then I caught Daniel looking toward me during the vows. It wasn't a long glance, just a second or two, but there was something thoughtful in his expression, almost like he was checking whether I was comfortable sitting where I was. When our eyes met, he gave me a small smile before turning back toward the officiant. That tiny act of kindness shouldn't have mattered so much. Yet after years of feeling invisible inside my own family, simply being acknowledged felt surprisingly meaningful. During the cocktail hour, guests scattered across the gardens, overlooking the lake. Children chased each other through flower beds, while photographers moved constantly between family groups. I spent most of the time talking with relatives I hadn't seen in years. Almost every conversation eventually reached the same question. "How have you been?" Most people asked sincerely. A few asked awkwardly, unsure whether mentioning my health was appropriate. I answered honestly without turning my condition into the center of every conversation. It had become second nature. I didn't want sympathy. I just wanted normal human interaction. About halfway through the reception, Daniel approached while Vivian was busy greeting another group of guests. "I'm glad you made it," he said. "Me too." He hesitated before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" I smiled. "You usually do," he chuckled softly. "Fair enough." Then his expression became serious. "Vivian mentioned you might prefer staying seated during family photos because standing would be uncomfortable." "That's true," I answered. "But if there's a safe way to take one standing for a few seconds with support, I'm happy to try." He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say." I frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because she told me you refused to cooperate whenever anyone suggested alternatives." I let out a slow breath. "Daniel, has she ever actually asked me?" His silence answered the question before he spoke. "No." "Then maybe that's the problem." Before either of us could continue, Vivian appeared beside him wearing a bright smile that disappeared the instant she realized we had been talking alone. "There you are," she said to Daniel, slipping her arm through his. Then she looked at me. "Family photos are in 15 minutes. I'll be there." "Good," she replied. "Please don't wander off." Her tone sounded friendly enough to anyone listening. I heard the warning underneath it. As she walked away, Daniel glanced back once, clearly thinking about our conversation. For the first time, I suspected he was beginning to notice how differently Vivian spoke to me when no one else paid attention. Family portraits were scheduled immediately after dinner. The photographer gathered everyone near a wide staircase overlooking the ballroom. Rows of chairs had already been arranged. Elderly relatives sat in front. Children gathered along the steps. Everything looked organized and efficient. The photographer smiled as he checked names against a printed list. "Perfect," he said. "Ms. Vaughn. We'll place your wheelchair right here in the center so everyone fits naturally." I rolled forward exactly where he indicated. From his perspective, it made complete sense. I wasn't hidden in the back. I wasn't awkwardly separated from everyone else. I was simply part of the family. I actually appreciated that. Vivian did not. I saw the change on her face almost instantly. It was subtle at first. Her smile tightened. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked from me to the photographer and back again. "Actually," she interrupted, "could we move the chair somewhere less noticeable?" The photographer blinked. "This arrangement balances everyone nicely." "I'd rather not have the wheelchair right in the middle." A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. I spoke before anyone else could. "I'm happy to move wherever works best as long as I don't have to stand for long." The photographer nodded reassuringly. "We can absolutely adjust positions without changing your seating." I thought that settled it. Apparently, Vivian had already decided otherwise. She crossed her arms and stared directly at me. "You stood during cocktail hour. For a few seconds. You walked into the ceremony, oozing support. Then you can stand for one picture." I kept my voice calm. "My doctor recommends I stay seated unless I know I have stable support." She laughed. Not loudly. Just enough for the people nearest us to hear. "Everything always comes back to your doctor." My father shifted uncomfortably beside us. My mother looked down at the floor. Neither one spoke. Again, I felt every eye in the room drifting toward us. The photographer cleared his throat. "We can begin whenever everyone's ready." I looked directly at Vivian. "I'm ready." She didn't answer. She simply kept staring at the wheelchair as though it had personally insulted her. Then she took one slow step toward me. Something inside me tightened immediately. I had seen that expression before. It was the same look she wore whenever she became convinced she alone knew what was best for everyone else. And in that moment, I realized the feeling I'd carried since waking up that morning hadn't been anxiety at all. It had been instinct. Instinct has a strange way of whispering before disaster ever starts shouting. Vivian stopped less than 2 feet away from me, her smile perfectly fixed for everyone watching. But I knew that expression too well. It was the smile she wore whenever she had already decided she was right, and everyone else simply hadn't caught up yet. "Stand up," she said quietly enough that only the people closest to us could hear. "Vivian," I answered just as softly, "I'm staying in the chair. You'll be standing for 10 seconds. "No." Her smile didn't move. "Don't embarrass me today." I almost laughed at the irony. I'm not the one making a scene. For a brief second, I thought she might let it go. The photographer was already raising his camera. Guests were becoming impatient. Someone joked about needing another drink if family photos took much longer. All Vivian had to do was sit beside Daniel, smile, and let the photographer take the picture. Instead, she took another step toward me. "You're making yourself the center of attention again," she whispered. "I'm sitting exactly where the photographer asked me to." "Because he doesn't understand what you're doing." I looked directly into her eyes. "Neither do you." That sentence broke whatever patience she still had. "Vivian?" Daniel called gently from behind her. "Let's just take the picture." She didn't even turn around. "1 second." The photographer lowered his camera. "Ma'am, we're ready whenever you are." "We're almost ready," Vivian replied without looking away from me. Then she reached toward the handles of my wheelchair. I instinctively locked the wheels with my hands. "Don't," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She smiled again. "If you can walk into the ceremony, you can stand for one photograph." "That's not how my condition works." "That's what you keep telling everyone." My father shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Vivian," he began. My heart lifted for half a second. Finally he was going to stop this. "Let's not argue right now," he finished. Those words landed harder than anything Vivian had said all day, not because they surprised me, because they confirmed exactly who my parents still believed was responsible for keeping the peace. Me? I slowly turned toward my father. Dad. He looked at me but couldn't hold my eyes for more than a moment. Please, he muttered. Not today. Not today. The same sentence. Different year. Different gathering. Same outcome. I looked at my mother next. She stood frozen beside one of my aunts, gripping her bouquet so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She knew. I could see it all over her face. She knew Vivian was wrong. She knew I wasn't pretending. She knew exactly what could happen if I lost my balance. Yet she said nothing. Again, I turned back toward Vivian. I'm staying seated. No, you're not. Before I realized what she intended to do, she grabbed my forearm with surprising force. Vivian? Daniel's voice rose sharply. She ignored him. Stand up. You're hurting me? Then prove me wrong. My pulse exploded. Stop. She tightened her grip instead. Stand. Vivian, I said louder this time. Let go. The ballroom had gone almost completely silent. Even relatives standing several rows away had stopped talking. Everyone knew something was happening. Nobody seemed to believe it would go much further. I don't think anyone imagined what came next. Vivian suddenly pulled upward with both hands. It happened so quickly my body couldn't react. My wheelchair rolled backward as my feet instinctively searched for stable ground. For one impossible second, I was halfway standing without control over my own body. Then my knees buckled, my left foot twisted awkwardly, my balance disappeared. I reached toward the armrest that was no longer beneath me. There was nothing there. I remember hearing someone scream before I actually hit the floor. Then came the impact. The polished wood was harder than I expected. My shoulder struck first, followed by my hip. My hands scraped across the floor as I instinctively tried to stop myself. The room erupted. Chairs scraped backward. Several guests rushed forward at once. Someone shouted for medical assistance. I heard my mother cry my name. Everything sounded strangely distant, almost underwater. I wasn't unconscious, just overwhelmed. I stared at the ceiling while trying to slow my breathing. More than pain, I felt disbelief, not because Vivian had done it, deep down. Maybe I'd always known she was capable of crossing one more line. What shocked me was that she'd done it in front of everyone. Elara. Nora dropped to her knees beside me before anyone else reached me. Don't move. I'm okay. I whispered automatically, even though I wasn't sure that was true. Daniel arrived a second later. He looked from me to Vivian, then back again. Did she tell you to stop? He asked quietly. I nodded. Several times. He closed his eyes for a moment, as though trying to process what he had just witnessed. Behind him, Vivian finally spoke. She lost her balance. I was trying to help. Nobody answered. The silence this time was different. It wasn't the polite silence my family had mastered over the years. It was the silence of people realizing they had just watched something that couldn't be explained away. The photographer slowly lowered his camera. An elderly uncle shook his head without saying a word. My cousin Michael looked openly horrified. Even children had stopped moving. My father finally knelt beside me. Can you move your fingers? He asked nervously. I flexed them slowly. Yes? Your legs? I swallowed. I think so. A staff member from the venue hurried over with a first aid kit while another called for on-site medical personnel. Nora squeezed my hand gently. Don't try to sit up yet. I nodded. Across the room, Vivian kept talking, her voice becoming more frantic with every sentence. She stood earlier today. Ask anyone. She walked into the ceremony. I was just helping her. Daniel turned toward her so slowly that the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Helping, he repeated. Yes, she asked you to stop. Vivian folded her arms defensively. She panicked. She said no. She exaggerates everything. Daniel stared at her for several long seconds. I'd never seen his expression look so empty, not angry, not emotional, just disappointed. Vivian, he said quietly. I heard her tell you to stop. She blinked. What? Twice. The color drained from her face. Daniel. 3 times. She looked around the ballroom, clearly searching for someone, anyone, to support her version of events. My parents remained silent. My relatives avoided her eyes. The photographer stared at the floor. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody defended her. For the first time in years, Vivian found herself standing completely alone. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They carefully examined me before helping me onto a stretcher as a precaution. My shoulder throbbed, but they believed nothing was broken. As they wheeled me toward the exit, I caught one final glimpse of the ballroom. Guests stood frozen in small groups. My mother was crying quietly. My father looked 20 years older than he had that morning. Vivian kept trying to explain herself to anyone willing to listen. Almost no one was listening anymore. Daniel remained standing exactly where he'd been during the confrontation, his wedding jacket still perfectly pressed. His tie still neatly straight. Yet somehow he looked like a man whose entire future had just collapsed. As the ambulance doors closed, I thought the worst part of the day was finally over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because while everyone else believed the wedding had just fallen apart, Daniel had already made a decision that would change every one of our lives. I spent the next 4 hours in the emergency department answering the same questions over and over again. Could I move my toes? Did I lose consciousness? Where did it hurt the most? The doctors were thorough because my medical history made even a minor fall more complicated than it might have been for someone else. Thankfully, the scans showed no fractures. My shoulder was badly bruised, and the muscles around my hip had been strained, but the neurologist on call delivered the sentence I had been praying to hear. "You were fortunate," she said while reviewing the imaging results. A fall like that could have been much worse. I nodded slowly, unable to stop thinking about one simple fact. I hadn't fallen because of my condition. I had fallen because someone decided she knew my body better than I did. Nora stayed beside me the entire time, refusing to leave even long after visiting hours technically ended. She sat quietly scrolling through her phone while I tried to rest between examinations. Around midnight she looked up and frowned. "Your phone has been vibrating for almost an hour." I reached for it reluctantly. There were 23 missed calls. Most came from my mother. Several were from my father. A few distant relatives had also left messages asking how I was feeling. Vivian had called exactly once. She hadn't left a voicemail. Instead, there was a single text message waiting beneath the missed calls. "I never meant for you to fall. You overreacted, and everything got out of control." I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone again. Nora watched my expression. "Her?" I nodded. "Does she apologize?" I let out a tired laugh. "Not exactly." Nora didn't ask to read the message. She didn't need to. "You don't owe anyone an answer tonight." For once, I took her advice. The following morning, I was discharged with instructions to rest, avoid unnecessary strain, and schedule follow-up appointments with my neurologist. My shoulder ached every time I shifted position, but emotionally I felt strangely numb. The events at the wedding replayed inside my head in fragments, rather than complete memories. Vivian's hand grabbing my arm, my father's unfinished sentence. Daniel saying, "I heard her tell you to stop." More than anything else, that sentence kept returning. Someone had finally heard me. Someone had finally believed me in the exact moment it mattered. By the time Nora drove me home, local family gossip had already spread faster than I thought possible. My cousin Michael called first. "Everyone's talking about yesterday," he said carefully. "Nobody can believe what happened." "I wish I couldn't either." He hesitated. "Vivian keeps saying she was only trying to help." I closed my eyes. "Did she mention I asked her to stop?" Silence answered before he did. "No, of course she didn't." After hanging up, I spent the rest of the afternoon ignoring my phone. I wasn't ready for conversations. I wasn't ready to comfort people who suddenly felt guilty for watching years of smaller moments without saying anything. Late that evening, someone knocked on my front door. I expected my parents. Instead, I found Daniel standing on my porch holding a paper bag from a nearby cafe. He looked exhausted. His suit from the wedding had been replaced by jeans and a plain grey sweater. But the dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept either. "I know this isn't the best time," he said quietly. If you want me to leave, I will. I studied his face for a moment before stepping aside. Come in. We sat across from each other in my living room. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he slid the paper bag across the coffee table. Your favorite blueberry muffins, he said. Vivian once told me you always ordered them after physical therapy appointments. I almost smiled. She remembered that. Apparently, the irony wasn't lost on either of us. Daniel took a slow breath. I came because I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay? He leaned forward slightly. Has she always treated you like that? The question settled heavily between us. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I had spent years convincing myself the answer wasn't as bad as it really was. I looked toward the window before speaking. Yesterday was the worst thing she's ever done. He waited. But it wasn't the first time she made me feel like my condition was something I had to defend. He nodded without interrupting. So I told him everything. I told him about the birthday dinner, the jokes, the comments, the family gatherings where she casually questioned my diagnosis, the times my parents stayed silent because correcting her would create tension. I told him about the phone call from my mother asking whether I could stand for pictures before anyone asked whether it would be safe. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't dramatize. I simply described years of moments exactly as I remembered them. When I finished, Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. She never told me any of that. What did she tell you? I asked. He looked embarrassed. She said your doctors encouraged you to become more active, but you preferred letting people think you were worse because it made everyone protective. I stared at him in disbelief. She actually said that? He nodded slowly. I didn't fully believe it, but I also didn't know enough to question it. We sat in silence again. Finally, he spoke so quietly I almost missed it. I think I wanted to believe the woman I was going to marry. I understood that. If our positions had been reversed, maybe I would have done the same. Yesterday, he continued, when she grabbed you, I realized something. What? She wasn't trying to help you stand? He paused. She was trying to prove herself right. Those words landed with surprising force, because they captured something I had struggled to explain for years. Vivian didn't actually care whether I could stand. She cared about winning an argument no one else wanted to have. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. There's something else. He unlocked the screen and opened a video. I wasn't recording you, he said quickly. I was recording the photographer arranging everyone because Vivian kept complaining about the setup. I planned to show her later how unreasonable she sounded. He handed me the phone. The video began several minutes before the fall. I watched as the photographer calmly explained the seating arrangement. I heard my own voice offering to move if necessary. I watched Vivian reject every compromise. Then came the part that made my chest tighten. The camera clearly captured me saying, I'm staying seated. It recorded me saying, please don't. It recorded me saying, let go. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding, no missing context. Every word was unmistakably clear. Daniel stopped the video before the actual fall. I didn't think you needed to watch that part again. I handed the phone back without speaking. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar replacing helplessness. Not revenge, relief. The truth existed outside my memory now. It existed where no one could rewrite it. Daniel looked at me carefully. I'm not asking what I should do. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. I've already decided. My heart skipped. Decided what? He held my gaze for several long seconds before answering. Yesterday wasn't a mistake. His voice was calm but steady. It revealed who Vivian really is. I suddenly knew what he was about to say before the words left his mouth. There isn't going to be a wedding anymore. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel happy. Mostly, I felt sad for the man sitting across from me. He hadn't only lost a fiancée, he had lost the future he thought he understood. Before leaving, Daniel stopped at the front door. One more thing, he said. Your parents asked if I'd speak to them tomorrow. Will you? He nodded once. Yes. He opened the door, then looked back. I think it's time everyone stopped pretending they didn't know what was happening. After he left, I sat alone in my quiet living room for a long time. Somewhere across town, my parents were probably trying to convince themselves the family could still be repaired. Vivian was likely rehearsing another explanation that made her the victim. But for the first time since my diagnosis, the truth no longer belonged only to me. And the people who had spent years avoiding it were about to discover that silence could no longer protect anyone. The next afternoon, my parents asked if they could come over. They didn't call first. They simply showed up together, standing on my porch with expressions that looked older than I remembered. My father held a small paper bag from my favorite bakery. My mother clutched a container of homemade soup, as though it might somehow repair everything that had happened. When I opened the door, neither of them spoke immediately. We stood there in uncomfortable silence until I finally stepped aside. "Come in." They sat together on my couch while I settled carefully into the chair across from them. Nobody touched the food they'd brought. My father cleared his throat twice before finding his voice. "How are you feeling?" It was such an ordinary question that I almost laughed. "Physically?" I asked. "Or emotionally?" He lowered his eyes. "Both. The bruises will heal." I paused. "I'm not sure about the rest." My mother wiped at her eyes before tears could fully form. "Elara, before either of you apologize," I interrupted gently, "I need to ask something." They both nodded. When Vivian started saying, "I didn't really need my wheelchair," did either of you ever believe her? They answered at exactly the same time. "No." The word came so quickly neither of them had time to think about it. I nodded slowly. "Then why didn't you ever say that out loud?" Neither answered immediately. My father stared at the floor. My mother twisted her wedding ring around her finger. "Finally," she whispered, because every time we corrected her, she became angry. I waited. And she looked at me helplessly. We thought if we ignored it, eventually she'd stop. I felt something inside me quietly break. Not because I had discovered something new, because hearing it spoken aloud somehow made it more real. "She didn't stop," I said. "She got worse." My father finally looked up. "You're right." His voice sounded rough. "Every time we stayed silent, we taught her there would be no consequences." He swallowed hard. "We thought we were protecting the family." "No," I replied softly. "You were protecting the person making the family unsafe." Nobody spoke after that. There wasn't anything left to argue about. The truth had become too simple. A knock interrupted the silence. My father frowned. "Were you expecting someone?" Before I could answer, Nora opened the door after using the spare key I had given her years earlier. She stopped when she saw my parents. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize." "It's okay," I assured her. "Come in." She carried grocery bags into the kitchen before returning to the living room. My mother stood awkwardly. "We'll leave." "You don't have to." Nora shook her head. "I'm just dropping these off." She placed the bags on the counter, then quietly disappeared onto the back patio to give us privacy. My mother watched her through the sliding glass door. "She's a good friend." "She is." "She's always protected you." I looked directly at my mother. "Yes." The room became painfully quiet again, because everyone understood what I hadn't said. She had done what my family never managed to do. My father's phone suddenly vibrated. He glanced at the screen before sighing deeply. "It's Daniel. You should answer," I said. He hesitated but eventually accepted the call, placing it on speaker almost without thinking. Daniel's voice sounded calm. Too calm. "Richard." "Helen. I wanted you both to hear this together." My mother instinctively reached for my father's hand. "I'm listening," my father replied. "I ended my engagement with Vivian this morning." The words hung in the room like heavy rain clouds. Even though I already knew his decision, hearing him say it aloud felt different. Final. Real. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. "Daniel. This wasn't because of one bad day," he continued. "It was because that day showed me a pattern I refused to see before." My father closed his eyes. "I understand." Daniel continued speaking, his voice never rising. "I asked myself one question all night. If Vivian could ignore someone saying stop in front of 200 witnesses, what would happen when no one else was watching? Nobody answered. Nobody could. I can't marry someone who believes she has the right to decide what another person can do with their own body. Another long silence followed. Finally, my father spoke. You made the right decision. I saw genuine pain cross his face as he admitted it. Daniel exhaled quietly. Vivian doesn't agree. I'm sure she doesn't. She's telling everyone I chose your daughter over her. My father looked toward me. That's not what happened. I know. Daniel's voice softened. I chose the truth. After ending the call, my parents remained seated without speaking. My mother quietly cried while staring at her folded hands. My father looked exhausted. For the first time in my life, they weren't trying to fix the situation. They finally understood it couldn't be fixed with another request for everyone to calm down. That evening, family messages began arriving one after another. Some relatives apologized for never questioning Vivian's comments over the years. Others admitted they had always felt uncomfortable, but assumed my parents would speak up if anything was actually wrong. One message stood out from all the others. It came from Aunt Denise. I should have asked you instead of listening to assumptions. I'm sorry I didn't. I read that sentence 3 different times. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't perfect, but it accepted responsibility without making excuses. More people should learn how to apologize like that. 2 days later, my father called unexpectedly. Can I ask you something? Of course. Would you be willing to have dinner with your mother and me this weekend? I hesitated. Will Vivian be there? No? No. Yes. When I arrived at the restaurant that Saturday evening, my parents were already waiting. The conversation stayed awkward at first. We talked about work, physical therapy, and ordinary things. Eventually my father placed his fork down and looked directly at me. We've been seeing a family counselor. I blinked in surprise. Really? He nodded. The therapist asked us a question neither of us could answer. What was it? He took a slow breath. She asked, when we first noticed Vivian treating you differently. I already knew the answer before, he continued. Wasn't after your diagnosis? He admitted quietly. It started when you were children. My mother nodded through fresh tears. Whenever someone praised you, Vivian found a way to compete. And we always told you to let it go because you were younger. My father shook his head. We didn't realize we were rewarding the behavior. That confession hurt, but it also explained so much that had never made sense before. This wasn't a story about a wheelchair. It wasn't even a story about my illness. It was a story about years of small choices that eventually became one enormous mistake. As we left the restaurant, my father stopped beside my car. Vivian called this morning. I looked at him carefully. What did she want? She wants us to convince Daniel to reconsider. I almost smiled sadly. And my father met my eyes without hesitation for the first time in years. I told her there are consequences you can't ask someone else to erase. Hearing those words from him felt almost unbelievable. If he had spoken them 3 years earlier, perhaps none of this would have happened. But healing rarely begins at the moment we wish it had. It begins the moment someone finally decides to stop pretending the truth is negotiable. Meanwhile, across, Vivian was still refusing to accept that everyone else had moved on without her version of the story, and desperation was about to push her into making the biggest mistake of all. About 3 weeks passed before I heard directly from Vivian again. Until then, everything I knew came through other people. According to my mother, she insisted Daniel had abandoned her over one misunderstanding. According to my aunt, she blamed the photographer for arranging the family incorrectly. According to one of her bridesmaids, she was telling anyone who would listen that I had exaggerated the entire incident to destroy her wedding. None of it surprised me anymore. Accepting responsibility had never come naturally to Vivian. Rewriting reality always seemed easier. One Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was finishing work. Her name appeared on the screen. I stared at it until the call ended. Seconds later, another call came, then another, Finally, a text message appeared. "You owe me 5 minutes." I almost laughed. For years I had owed her patience, understanding, silence. Apparently now I owed her time too. I didn't answer. That evening, she showed up outside my apartment building without warning. Nora happened to be visiting, and we noticed Vivian's car through the living room window before she reached the door. Nora looked at me. "Do you want me to stay? Please." A moment later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door just enough to speak without inviting her inside. Vivian looked exhausted. The confidence she had carried her entire life seemed cracked around the edges, but it hadn't disappeared. "Can we talk?" she asked. "We're talking? Not like this. This is the only way I'm comfortable." She let out an impatient breath. "Seriously, Elara." I stayed calm. "What do you want?" Her expression immediately hardened. "Daniel won't answer my calls." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Pretend this has nothing to do with you." I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You think I ended your engagement? You turned everyone against me." I shook my head slowly. "Vivian, everyone watched what happened. Because you made me look like a monster." "No." I met her eyes without raising my voice. "You made a choice. People reacted to that choice." For a moment, I thought she might actually reflect on what I said. Instead, she folded her arms. "You could tell them it wasn't that bad." I stared at her. "You still don't understand." "Understand what?" "The problem wasn't that I fell." I paused. "The problem was that I told you to stop, and you decided your opinion mattered more than my answer." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I continued quietly. "Do you know what hurts the most?" She didn't respond. "I spent years hoping one day you'd believe me." I smiled sadly. "No, I don't need you to." For the first time since arriving, she looked uncertain, not guilty, not remorseful, just confused that her words no longer carried the power they once had. "So that's it?" she asked. "You're just walking away?" "No," I answered honestly. "I'm finally living my own life." She stood there another few seconds before turning toward her car without another word. I watched her drive away, feeling something I hadn't expected. Relief, not because she was gone, because I no longer felt responsible for changing her. A week later, my parents invited several close relatives to their house. My father told me he wanted to say something to the family together, instead of through phone calls or gossip. I almost declined. Large family gatherings had become exhausting, but this one felt different. When I arrived, there were only 12 people. My aunt, my uncle, a few cousins, and my parents. Vivian wasn't there. My father stood after everyone finished eating. He held a folded piece of paper, but never looked down at it. "I asked you here because Helen and I owe all of you an apology." The room immediately became quiet. He looked toward me first. "Especially Elara." My mother reached for his hand before he continued. "For years, we knew our younger daughter had a medical condition that required accommodations." He swallowed hard. "We also knew our older daughter repeatedly questioned that condition." No one interrupted. Every time Vivian made another comment, we chose the easier path. We asked Elara to ignore it. We asked everyone else to move on. He shook his head slowly. "We believed avoiding conflict would protect our family." He looked around the room. Instead, our silence convinced Vivian she was right. My mother began crying openly. "We're not asking anyone to forgive us today." She looked directly at me. "We only want you to know that we finally understand what our silence cost you." I hadn't expected those words to affect me as much as they did. They didn't erase anything. They didn't undo years of loneliness. But they mattered because they accepted responsibility without asking me to make everyone feel better. My cousin Michael quietly spoke next. "Honestly, I always believed Elara." I turned toward him in surprise. "You did," he nodded. "I just assumed Aunt Helen or Uncle Richard would handle it." Several other relatives admitted they had thought the same thing. That realization hit me almost harder than Vivian's accusations ever had. So many people had been waiting for someone else to speak first, and because no one did, the silence grew louder every year. Near the end of the evening, my father handed me a small envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it later," When I got home, I found a handwritten letter inside. My father wasn't a man who expressed emotions easily, so seeing several pages filled in his careful handwriting already felt unusual. He wrote about the first day I learned to ride a bicycle, about how determined I had always been, about how proud he was of my strength. Then came the sentence that made me cry. I spent years teaching you to be brave while failing to be brave myself. I read those words over and over again. It wasn't a perfect apology. Nothing could be. But it was honest. Sometimes honesty is enough to begin healing. A month later, I ran into Daniel completely by accident at a bookstore. We both reached for the same novel at the same time and laughed awkwardly. "Some habits never change," he said. "Still buying too many books." "Always." We walked together toward the coffee shop inside the store. Neither of us mentioned Vivian immediately. Eventually he did. "She's still angry with everyone." I nodded. I figured. "I honestly hope she gets help." His answer surprised me. "You don't hate her." He looked thoughtful. "No?" He stirred his coffee slowly. "I just don't trust her anymore." There was wisdom in that distinction. Hate keeps people connected in unhealthy ways. Lack of trust simply changes the distance between them. Before leaving, Daniel smiled kindly. "For what it's worth, thank you." I frowned. "For what?" "For never trying to convince me to choose sides." He paused. "You simply told the truth." I watched him walk away feeling lighter than I had in years. My story had never really been about proving Vivian wrong. It had always been about finally being heard. And now that the truth belonged to everyone instead of just me, there was only one thing left to do: move forward. 6 months later, my life looked nothing like it had before Vivian's wedding. The bruises had disappeared long ago, and with consistent physical therapy, I had returned to the same level of mobility I enjoyed before the fall. Some days I still used my cane. On crowded days, airports, concerts, or long events, I still used my wheelchair without apology or embarrassment. The difference wasn't my condition. The difference was that I no longer felt obligated to explain it to anyone. If strangers looked confused because they had seen me stand a few minutes earlier, that was no longer my burden to carry. Invisible disabilities didn't become less real simply because someone else failed to understand them. That lesson had taken me years to learn, but only one afternoon to finally believe. Work had changed too. A few months after everything happened, I accepted a promotion to lead the quality assurance department at the hospital network where I worked. During my first meeting with the executive team, one of the administrators quietly asked whether I would need any workplace accommodations for longer meetings. It was such a simple question, asked without judgment or hesitation, that I almost became emotional. They weren't questioning my abilities. They were asking what I needed to succeed. That was all accommodation had ever meant. Not special treatment, just equal opportunity. Around the same time, Nora convinced me to join a local support group for adults living with invisible neurological conditions. I almost declined. I had spent years avoiding spaces where my diagnosis became the main topic of conversation. She smiled and said, "Maybe someone there needs to hear what you've already survived." She was right. During my first meeting, a young woman named Emily admitted she had stopped using her mobility aid because people accused her of faking whenever they saw her walking without it. I recognized the fear in her voice immediately because I had once sounded exactly the same. After the meeting ended, she approached me privately. "How did you stop caring what people think?" she asked. I smiled gently. "I didn't." She looked confused. "Really?" "I just stopped believing their opinions mattered more than my doctor's or my own body." She laughed softly through tears. "I'm still working on that." "So am I," I admitted. Healing wasn't a finish line. It was a direction. My relationship with my parents remained careful but genuine. Trust returned slowly, exactly the way it should after being broken for so many years. They continued attending counseling even after I stopped asking about it. My father became surprisingly outspoken whenever conversations about disability arose, especially among extended family members. One afternoon during a family barbecue, a distant cousin casually joked that someone parking in an accessible space didn't look disabled. Before I could respond, my father calmly said, "You can't diagnose another person's health by looking at them." The conversation ended immediately. I caught his eye across the yard. He didn't smile proudly or look toward me for approval. He simply continued eating his lunch. For anyone else, it would have been an ordinary sentence. For him, it represented years of growth. My mother changed too. She volunteered at a local rehabilitation center once a week, helping organize community events for families caring for relatives with long-term medical conditions. One evening she admitted something that stayed with me. "I spent years believing love meant keeping everyone comfortable," she said. "No, I know love sometimes means making the right person uncomfortable." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That's a lesson a lot of people never learn. Vivian, on the other hand, remained mostly absent from my life. We exchanged exactly 2 messages over those 6 months. Both were about practical family matters. Neither mentioned the wedding. Neither mentioned the fall. According to my parents, she eventually moved to another city after accepting a management position with a different company. She still believed Daniel had overreacted. She still believed I had destroyed her future. For a long time I wondered whether that bothered me. Eventually I realized something important. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. I had let go of my anger because carrying it only continued hurting me. But forgiveness didn't require rebuilding a relationship with someone who refused to acknowledge the harm they had caused. Some bridges remain standing. Others simply become roads you no longer choose to travel. Nearly a year after the wedding, I received an unexpected invitation from the hospital where my neurologist worked. They were hosting an awareness event about invisible disabilities and patient advocacy. One of the organizers had read an article written by a relative describing what happened at the wedding, without using anyone's names, and wondered whether I would be willing to share my experience. Standing backstage before my talk, I felt the same nervousness I had felt on the morning of Vivian's wedding, but this time it was different. Back then I had feared being judged. Now I simply hoped my story might help someone else. When I walked onto the stage, I noticed wheelchairs, canes, walkers, service dogs, and family members scattered throughout the audience. Some conditions were visible, many were not. I looked across the room and began with one simple sentence. The hardest part of living with an invisible disability isn't the diagnosis. It's constantly being asked to prove you're telling the truth. The room became completely silent. For the next 30 minutes I spoke honestly about fear, shame, accommodation, boundaries, and the difference between support and pity. I never mentioned Vivian by name. This wasn't her story anymore. It was mine. Afterward, dozens of people came to thank me. One older man shook my hand and quietly said, "My daughter stopped using her wheelchair because people accused her of pretending. I'm taking her your speech tonight." I hugged him without saying anything, because there wasn't anything else to say. As I walked outside into the evening sunlight, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "Your mother and I are so proud of you, not because you endured what happened, but because you refused to let it define you." I smiled before slipping the phone back into my pocket. A year earlier, those words would have felt impossible. Today they simply felt true. People often ask whether I ever got revenge on my sister. The honest answer usually surprises them. I never needed revenge. The moment Vivian ignored my repeated pleas to stop, she revealed herself to everyone who mattered. I didn't expose her. She exposed herself. Daniel walked away because he witnessed the truth. My parents finally confronted years of silence because they could no longer hide from it. My relatives stopped making excuses because they had seen the consequences with their own eyes. And I discovered something far more valuable than revenge. I discovered that the strongest kind of justice doesn't come from humiliating the people who hurt you. It comes from refusing to surrender your dignity to them ever again. That wedding was supposed to become the happiest day of my sister's life. Instead, it became the day I finally stopped asking other people for permission to believe my own reality. Looking back now, I don't remember the flowers, the music, or the decorations. I remember the exact moment I decided that no one, not even my own family, would ever again convince me that protecting someone else's comfort was more important than protecting my own truth. And that decision changed the rest of my life forever. Sometimes people ask me whether I ever saw Vivian again. The answer is yes. Nearly 2 years after the wedding, we crossed paths unexpectedly at our grandmother's funeral. We arrived separately, stood on opposite sides of the chapel, and spoke only once. After the service ended, she walked toward me slowly. There was no anger in her face anymore, only exhaustion. For several seconds, we simply looked at one another like two strangers who happened to share the same childhood. Finally, she said, "I heard you're doing well?" "I am," I answered honestly. She nodded once. "I'm glad." I waited, wondering if this was finally the apology everyone had hoped would someday come. It didn't. She never mentioned the wedding. She never mentioned the wheelchair. She never mentioned the years she spent questioning my diagnosis. Instead, she quietly turned and walked toward the parking lot. Watching her leave, I realized something surprising. I wasn't disappointed. Years earlier, I believed closure depended on hearing the exact words. I was wrong. I'm sorry. But life rarely gives us endings that neat. Sometimes closure arrives the moment you realize you no longer need the apology you once thought you couldn't live without. My parents joined me outside a few minutes later. My father wrapped an arm around my shoulders while my mother asked whether I wanted to have dinner together before driving home. It was such an ordinary invitation that it almost made me smile. Ordinary had become something precious to us. We no longer spent every family gathering walking on eggshells, waiting for someone else's mood to decide whether the day would end peacefully. There was honesty now. There were boundaries. Most importantly, there was accountability. A few months after that funeral, the hospital invited me back to speak at another patient advocacy conference. This time the audience included newly diagnosed patients, medical students, nurses, and families trying to understand conditions they couldn't see. At the end of my presentation, a teenage girl raised her hand. She couldn't have been older than 16. She held a forearm crutch beside her chair and asked the question that stayed with me long after the event ended. "What do you do when the people who love you don't believe you're really hurting?" The room became completely silent. I looked at her and remembered exactly how lonely that question had once felt. "You keep telling the truth," I answered. "Not because it guarantees they'll believe you, but because your truth doesn't become less real when someone refuses to accept it. Find the people who listen. Trust the professionals who care for you. Set boundaries with the people who repeatedly dismiss your reality. And never measure the legitimacy of your pain by someone else's ability to understand it." She nodded while quietly wiping away tears. After the conference, her mother hugged me and whispered. She needed to hear that. As I walked back to my car that evening, I thought about everything that had changed since the day Vivian pulled me from my wheelchair. If someone had told me then that the worst day of my life would eventually become the reason I found my strongest voice, I never would have believed them. Yet that's exactly what happened. My story was never about a wedding. It was never really about my sister, either. It was about learning that protecting your peace is not selfish, that boundaries are not punishment, and that the people who truly love you will never ask you to sacrifice your dignity just to make someone else comfortable. The wheelchair I still use on difficult days no longer reminds me of humiliation. It reminds me of resilience. It reminds me that accepting help is not weakness. It reminds me that my worth has never depended on how many steps I can take or whether my illness is visible to other people. And every now and then, when someone gives me that familiar skeptical look after seeing me stand up from my chair, I simply smile and continue living my life. I don't explain. I don't argue. I don't try to convince them anymore. Because the greatest lesson I carried away from that wedding is one I hope everyone remembers. You do not have to prove your pain to deserve compassion, and you never have to shrink your truth to protect someone else's lie. The end.